Welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Form 1. Today we are talking about key performance indicators, also known as KPIs, and how you can make the most of them when reporting on digital platform activities. A few housekeeping mentions. You can join the conversation through the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen, as well as through Twitter. Our handle is @Form1, that's one word, and questions and comments can be left at the hashtag Form1. So my name is Christina Crawley. I'm there on the left-hand side. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Form 1, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. Our key presenter and the main person of the show who's going to be showering you with lots of great KPI knowledge is Autumn Rose, who is Form 1's Director of Analytics. And for those of you less familiar with Form 1, we are a full-service digital agency, and so we work with mission-driven organizations. And those organizations include nonprofits, foundations, and government agencies. And we're there to help them extend their influence in the areas that they care about most. If you'd like to hear more about Form 1, you're welcome to check us out at form1.com. And with that, without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to our expert of the hour, Autumn Rose. Take it away, Autumn.
Hello, hi everybody. Like Christina mentioned, my name is Autumn Rose. I'm the analytics director here at Form 1. Super excited today about talking about KPIs or key performance indicators, talking about how are we as nonprofits or government organizations, really groups that are working towards a mission, how can we use these things in order to really tell the story of success and help us move our mission forward? So at the end of the day, like my little slide here shows, and I love this little girl that's powering into the future, is that our power really comes from our mission. Like every initiative that we take on, every tactic that we leverage should be moving our mission forward in order to help create an impact. So really, at the end of the day, our KPIs, everything that we select for this, is here to tell that story of success. But at the end of the day, we do a lot. As communication professionals that we're spread thin and we're working on multiple initiatives across multiple channels, across multiple stakeholders, with lots of stakeholders, and not always working in the same direction. So sometimes it's easy to lose sight of our mission. So we start off with our mission. And, we got some tactics, we got our initiatives, and eventually, sometimes it just gets piled up and piled up and piled up, and it's easy to sometimes lose sight of what we're trying to get after. But at the end of the day, like we started with, it's our mission that brings clarity in driving our direction. So why do we need these KPIs? And we talk about KPIs being our analytics or our metrics that we're using to measure our overall strategy in the digital space. So there's really three things. The first one being is to help align our teams. We saw early on that in the earlier slide that there can be a lot of different things competing for our attention. But by having our KPIs and what we're working towards, it helps us align our teams across the organization to work towards a consistent set of objectives. And when we're working towards a consistent set of objectives, as in we're working in a straight line or as close to a straight line as possible, it helps us save time and save money. Because if we're not necessarily spending a lot of effort on things that aren't getting us to where we want to go, it allows us to pour those energies into the spaces that are getting the most value for our time. The next one is we're able to demonstrate a return on investment, our ROI, as in I put all these hours into this thing and I have a clear output that shows, oh, this is the impact that I made. This is the value of the work that I bring to the table and the value of the work that my team brings to the table and the value of the work of my organization brings to the table. The last one is to simplify reporting. I'm always love when I do in-person events to kind of get a sense from the group about, how many groups right now are doing analytics reporting. And from those, how many are really working towards a set of KPIs that help tell that story of overall impact? A lot of times when I talk with groups, the number one thing that they report as being a barrier for doing analytics and talking about how, telling that success story is that analytics can be a black hole that you can send somebody in and they can dig around that reporting for hours and not necessarily come out with anything solid story-wise. And there's a ton of time investment in kind of digging through those metrics to find that powerful story. When we do KPIs, and we do KPIs well, it really simplifies that process. So we have a consistent method of quantifying success, and we know right where to go to in order to track that. So it's a great thing that we have, we see the value of it, but you're like, okay, so how do we get there? I do a lot of things, and how do we actually narrow it down? Because at the end of the day, I don't want to necessarily do just a count of this is how many emails I sent, this is how many tweets I made. We're not talking about activities here. We're talking about impact and how are we really tracking those things overall. So today's session, we're not necessarily going to go into like, this is the one thing that you need to track, but really giving you a mental model to use when you're brainstorming what your KPIs should be. So it starts with your mission. Your mission should be used as the glue that ties together all your communications activities. So within your mission, there's probably a lot of tactics. And the thing that I usually look towards when I was working with a group is a lot of times you can figure out what these main top level channels, we'll call it, like those high level strategies from kind of a annual report or how your organization is structured. That kind of helps you give an idea of like what are those really high level ways that my organization is using to achieve the mission. And it aligns with your organizational structure usually. To continue mapping it together, identifying specific projects and activities that your organization is taking on to achieve those initiatives. The big piece here is that for these objectives, this isn't necessarily have an email. These objectives are kind of more broader, as in we want to gain awareness of a certain issue. And as part of that gaining awareness, there's a whole bunch of things that we're trying to achieve with it. And those ways that we're doing this might include those other tactics such as email. Now, a question for all of you guys to reflect upon is how often or how many different objectives might you find that fall outside of what those core initiatives are? An activity I always recommend everyone to do, brainstorm like this. It's kind of a mind map way of doing it. But are there things that you can't tie directly to your mission? You can't necessarily tie an event that you hold or an email listserv that you carry out or, a big outreach initiative that you do. If you can't tie that back clearly either to an objective initiative or part of your core mission, it's time to just say no to those, because those are those things that, they seem like a great idea at the time. They kind of tangentially, you can see where they came into play. But you know what? If they're not directly relating and moving your mission forward, it's time to scale back on those things. It's time to just say no to those pieces and make sure that you're putting your focus and your reporting on those things that really are moving your mission forward. So selecting your KPIs. So the big thing I like to emphasize here is that there are a million ways of measuring anything. There is no right way or wrong. There's plenty of wrong ways, but there's no one right way of doing things. The big piece here is that we want to make sure that we're prioritizing the metrics that we're selecting, and that together they weave a great story. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking to your executive director, when you're talking to funders, when you're talking to different groups across your organization and outside of it too, you want to make sure that those KPIs fit together like a puzzle in order to tell that holistic story of what your work is doing and how they can work to move it forward. So when selecting your KPIs, we really want to make sure that it tells a story of performance. What do we mean by story of performance? And this is a little thing that I've been really playing around with how I tell this piece, is that when we select a KPI, we want to make sure that we're selecting a number that always means that it's improving if it goes up. Or we select a number that is like a KPI could be more than one metric in conjunction. So it's a set of metrics that show that that it's going up. The reason I say that it tells a story of performance is, take for instance, let's say you want to use pages per session as a KPI. I recommend not using that necessarily, but here's an instance where perhaps in theory, we as a collective organization have said we want to increase the pages per session. And we're going to follow that through and see how is this doing, increasing over time. So let's say we just redid the navigation of the site. That navigation is now confusing. People aren't a fan of it, but they still need what they need. So they're muddling through it. And by muddling through it, inadvertently, they're going to more pages within that session because they're lost. So the story of performance here, even though the KPI went up, as in the average pages per session went up, that's not necessarily a good thing. So as you're selecting your KPIs, do a litmus test of, if this number goes up, what other numbers do we need to look out for in order to make sure and ensure that we're telling that story of a positive performance and not necessarily optimizing for something that actually reflects a negative experience, as in users aren't lost. So that tells you the story of performance. The next one is making sure that it can be directly impacted. Here's another one that I really get challenged with when I'm working with clients and we're talking about selecting our KPIs. The big piece here is, what do you, your organization, and your team have control over? If you're unable to change the way your organization speaks on a specific matter, as in you're tied to a certain vocabulary, let's say, the last thing you want to do is select a KPI as being a reputation around a different vocabulary set, because you can't necessarily impact or change how your organization talks about itself. So you want to make sure that whatever you're selecting, an example to clarify what I was just talking about is that, let's say your KPI was related to search engine optimization, making sure that your organization is known for a specific issue. An instance where a group had an example where they could actually shift things in is we were working with the Smithsonian African American History Museum. They were interested in tracking and changing the language and how people talk about slavery. Instead of talking about slavery, they want to talk about enslaved peoples. So being able to track over time how many people are searching on the keyword that they're trying to shift to, that is a really strong KPI. But if you and your organization aren't able to change the language, you want to make sure that you're not necessarily trying to track something that can't be impacted. The next piece that we want to talk about is making sure it's measurable in the long term. Sometimes it's easy to say, I really want to achieve X, and perhaps you can make a shift in it in the short term. But perhaps what happens is that you're not able to necessarily collect data on that in the long term. It's a really time-intensive metric to run, or it's a very expensive data to collect. The key here is to make sure that you're able to create it in an efficient and consistent way over time, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about our KPIs, we're not talking about today and tomorrow or next week or this quarter. We're talking about improvement in the long term. We're talking about quarter over quarter, year over year, kind of tracking what those statistics are. The last one is to make sure that it's supported by your stakeholders. Make sure that leadership from across your organization has buy-in in saying, yes, that is something that we believe in, that is something that we want to move forward, because we want to make sure that one of the reasons of having our KPIs is to have collective buy-in and make sure that people are all working towards the same thing. Making sure that you have buy-in within your stakeholders helps move everything forward. There's a bit of a delay on here. So once we've established what they are, or what our ideas for our KPIs are, and we have kind of a baseline idea of, like, we did our little litmus tests and made sure that we hit those 4 categories. They tell a story of performance, they can be directly impacted by my team, they're measurable in the long term, and they're supported by my stakeholders. How do we set targets? Because it's one thing to say it's going up or down, but I find that it's really helpful to set a target. So when you're setting a target, as in like, where do we want to see ourselves in a month? Where do we want to see ourselves in a quarter? Where do we want to see ourselves in a year? And the big question I always get is, quote, how am I doing? Did I do well? Have I improved it enough? Is this going, the right direction? The big thing in setting your targets is making sure that they're based on past performance. I can't emphasize how important this is to make sure that they're based on past performance. The goal here is once you've selected your KPIs, maybe there's a quarter, maybe you have a luxury of being able to collect data for 6 months. The big thing is start measuring your KPIs and then set your targets based on past performance, and ensure that they're sustainable in both staff time and in budget. It's interesting how often, this might be a big initiative in your organization right now, or you might be taking it on in the future. But the key here is that sustainability. If you're selecting KPIs and you're only running a report once, that's defeated the purpose. The big thing is to make sure that everyone is kind of rallying around them and it's helping to kind of align your long-term efforts. So this is something like it's a pretty common piece that people use is being smart in selecting your targets. So being specific, which is like being tangible and concrete, making sure it's measurable. And measurable by a tool that you have access to and you have the budget to maintain. I tend to use, there's a lot of free tools out there. The key is to make sure that you are able to find the right one that tells the story you're looking for. The next thing is being achievable. That reflects back on that whole thing is that can you and your team impact that in order to move it forward? Is it realistic? Sometimes, setting a goal of doubling a certain KPI is totally realistic. Other times, improving things by 5% or 3% can be a really strong, realistic goal. The key here is to align what your strategies are to what your KPIs are. So if you're going to put a lot of effort into something, set a high goal. If you know that you don't have the budget, time, or staff to necessarily push the meter really strongly, set a more conservative goal. And then make sure that everything is time-bound, quarterly, monthly, yearly. Setting targets for yourself, benchmarks along the way. So, hey, in the end of the year, we want to double our subscribers to our e-newsletter. In order to hit that, we need to make sure that we get X number in the first quarter, Y in the second quarter, and Z in the third quarter in order to meet that year-end goal. So I talked a little bit about making sure that you are measuring your success against yourself, because there are no right targets. You're always going to be competing against yourself. So why is that we don't necessarily want to compete against others? A lot of times, like I said, a big question I get is, how am I doing compared to others in my industry? So why is it that I always emphasize not to necessarily compare it with others? Is that analytics configurations can impact the way data is collected severely. One case in point here, bounce rate. I never use bounce rate as a metric for a lot of different reasons, but that I won't necessarily dive into today. But bounce rate is one of those things that can so easily be manipulated based on how your analytics is set up. You could literally set it up so users are no longer, and just to back up a smidgen, is to say that bounce rate is when a user comes to your site and then leaves. They might come to a single page and then leaves. They might be on that page for 5 minutes, but as long as they didn't do anything other than go to that page, they will be considered a bounce. So that's what it is out of the box. But anybody who has a basic, can tweak the admin settings of your Google Analytics platform could literally tweak that and say, if someone stays for more than 3 seconds, they're not considered a bouncing anymore. So now all of a sudden, without doing anything to my website, I've just manipulated my bounce rate to go from 80% to 10% bounce rate. Okay, well, that's a great thing. Woohoo, we're all happy that the bounce rate went down, but that didn't actually indicate a change or an improvement to my site or my communications. all that is playing with the numbers. So if you can do that within your own site, you have to keep in mind that others are doing the same thing. Everyone is adjusting their site configuration in order to really help them get the most out of their analytics. So you can't necessarily take apples to apples. It truly is apples to oranges when you're talking about comparing your site to others. So at its most basic, analytics are not consistently configured across different sites. From there, the other thing is that behavior within types of content varies significantly. A nice case example is when you have long form content, as in you have a long article or a longer story or a longer blog post where you might have diagrams or pictures or something people are scrolling through. The average time on page for those really long engaging pages is going to be higher. You're going to want it to be higher versus a page that it's purely like perhaps it's an event calendar where people are scanning it, clicking on an event detail, and then going off to another site to go register. So you can see how you can't compare apples to oranges here, because success on a longer form content page versus success for a meeting registration form are night and day, completely different. The last piece is audiences behave differently. If you're talking to researchers or people who are looking for in-depth resources, their session on your website is going to be very different from a casual user or somebody who's looking for a very specific detail and running off, or somebody who's looking to donate to your cause or take an activist step. Different audiences have different goals, and therefore it's almost impossible to know exactly how different organizations are engaging those audiences. So the key here is to have KPIs that align with your audiences and your content types and your analytics configuration, and then setting goals and trying to meet them over time. So just to kind of articulate that point of how different content types and different audiences can really impact basic metrics, we did a quick audit on a couple of our sites. We at Forum 1 have done almost 100 analytics implementations. While that has shifted over time a little bit in how we do everything, as new functionality is released, Google's always changing and updating what it's offering. I can be confident in saying that I know how all of these were implemented, all these analytics were implemented, and therefore be able to really kind of get an apples to apples kind of idea. So just to give you a sense here for bounce rate, an interesting piece is that for websites that are more information distribution sites, I just kind of lump this as in these are sites, the whole goal here is to release reports, do thought pieces, and really distribute information about certain issues. Their bounce rates tend to be around 63%. Similar with community sites being around 60% for community websites. Community sites being membership-based, where folks are logging in order to share resources and so forth. The last one is interesting because data exploration sites. So these are sites where there's a lot of interactive data charts, trending graphs, maps, and so forth. An interesting thing for that is bounce rate goes down to 34%. So even when your implementation is virtually identical, when the case of this, with holding everything else consistent, bounce rates can vary significantly based on what type of information you're distributing and how your site is, what information you're putting on the site. Next one is pages per session. We kind of used this example earlier, is that pages per session for information distribution sites are around 2.35, community sites 2.75 pages per session, and then data exploration sites being around 4.4 pages. So you can see that these are all averages of a wide range of different types of sites and how much they vary. It's funny because you might not think that 2.35 versus 2.75 pages per session is a big difference, but that is, I would say it's a pretty substantial one. So now that we've kind of reflected on our mission, we've taken a look at all of our activities, we've identified a number of KPIs that kind of help measure what each one of those tactics and objectives and initiatives are that work towards our mission. We've done our litmus test of, making sure that these are quality our KPIs. We've got the buy-in, and now we've got our benchmarks. What are we going to do with all of that? Because at the end of the day, if we stop there as in we say, we're going to meet this goal, it doesn't necessarily help us meet it. We have to actually start communicating that work out. And how are we going to do that? That's a big piece, and that's one of the major points that I find as being a turning point in making sure that you are actually having this being able to be adopted long term, and that the buy-in continues over the quarters or years. So when we're talking about building website content, and we're doing it from the UX point of view or from the marketing point of view, we're always talking about talking to your audiences. So your impact stories will align with your audiences. So we made a difference with this audience type, or hey, we really supported the activists in doing X, or hey, the researchers are really able to dive into the research and explore the data in this way. Our impact stories are still talking about our audiences and what we did with them. But when we're reporting it in, our reporting is going to align ourselves with our organization structure. So what does that mean? At the end of the day, we're going to kind of look at how we're going to report that up. So I've kind of taken that same structure we introduced in the beginning of what we're doing, and we're going to look at each level of our staff and how our organization is put together, and think about strategically who needs what when. So the doers. And granted, your organization may be organized differently, or you might have the same person in multiple roles here, but the key here is just to kind of get that sense of where the ladder lies. So these are who I call the doers. These are the folks who are tweeting. These are the people who are putting together your newsletter. These are the people who are publishing your content. These are the people who are actually rubber hit the road, things getting done. At the end of the day, for reporting, these folks need real-time self-service numbers. They don't need to be statisticians or analysts per se, but you need to make sure that it's clear and it's easy that when they're posting content, if they're doing A/B tests on your newsletter or other pieces, they're easily able to kind of check in and say, yes, what I did well, or what I didn't do so well, and I can learn from my mistakes. The key here is that everything is granular. It's granular reporting on the performance of their specific activities, and they're able to compare year-over-year performance and benchmarks. So the key here is not to be working in the dark, but have a clear understanding of this is what's expected of me and expected of my e-newsletters. So I make sure that I can raise a flag if we're kind of falling short, or make adjustments if we need to improve. So here's an example of something very simple, straightforward. Google Analytics now allows you to create custom reports, which is fantastic. There's a lot of great reports that come out of the box there, but for this particular instance, and I use Forum 1 as a nice example here, is that we want all of our staff to write blog posts. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that people are posting blogs that people are reading and are driving traffic. So in order to have self-service for those individuals publishing blog posts, we have a nice quick dashboard or custom report here that allows us to quickly see, oh, this is how I'm doing. This is how my blog posts are doing because I published one recently, and this is how long people are spending and engaging on it. The key here is that it's explorable. So if you click on the name, I can then go ahead and see how many blog posts that I've published and see the individual performance. It's just a nice little self-service piece that I, as someone who's, quote, a doer, can actually go in and see the performance of my content. It's not that I'm just creating things and sending it to a black hole. Getting positive feedback or reinforcement regularly really helps me stay motivated to keep everything going throughout the year. So going down another level deeper. So I am calling these as program managers. You may call it something differently within your organization. But the key here is they don't necessarily need things on an everyday basis. Perhaps it's nice for them to have that, but having something that's more of a weekly or monthly synthesized report would be nicer than having just all the raw data. So what's included in these kind of reports? Here, we're going to be summarizing the tactic performance in the relationship to the objective that they are looking to achieve. So if I'm a program manager and I'm really big on, let's say, analytics, I don't necessarily need to see all the blog posts. So we'll say the tactic is blogging. I don't need to see all the blog posts. I just want to see the blog posts that were related to the issue that I'm trying to move forward, analytics. So instead of seeing all the ones that our 30 or 70 staff have published, I'm able to do a quick synthesized report that says, these are the folks that published a blog post. This is overall how it's doing, in order to see how we're trending. This stuff should be able to be compared year over year and map the performance to our benchmarks to make sure that my slice of the pie, my objective, is doing well over time. The last thing that this report should include is the doers can help write this report and propose opportunities to improve and expand or revise tactics. This is a really important piece, this last one, because this is what makes the real difference between, I find to make the big difference between a self-service dashboard and like a synthesized report. This gives you an opportunity to reflect back on the performance of those past tasks and think strategically, what can we do differently? And they're actually documented there in order to start moving decisions forward. So here happens to be an example of a synthesized piece where we have our blogs. We're able to kind of show it trend over year quickly, and we're able to see actually lower on this page is like the different issue areas. So I'm able to see specifically which issue areas are going on and what the published date is. And as a note, this is purely built on a Google spreadsheet or a Google Doc. It automatically pulls in from Google Analytics and it's dynamic. And then it's easy to add a narrative on the bottom in order to kind of show this is what's been going on. The key here is to make sure that we know what our KPIs are, we know what we want to see about them, and we're able to document things easily, consistently, and efficiently. So continuing up the ladder, directors. Directors don't necessarily need something every week. Maybe they need it monthly or quarterly. The big differentiator between our reporting to the program managers versus our directors is, instead of saying, here's the lay of the land of options that we can improve, it's much more targeted. We're talking about the monthly performance summary of all the related objectives. So we're not just looking at one piece of the pie, we're looking at all the pieces of pie that relate to that initiative. We're also looking at the highlights that were uniquely successful or failures, because we can learn just as much from our failures or more than we can from our successes. So here's where we want to do a roll-up. We don't want to talk about all the nitty-gritty things, but we just want to give a little bit of spice to the report in order to show, like, this is what we tried and this is what we learned. The next one is, we're no longer giving you the range of options that you can do, but we're being a little more authoritative and saying, these are the recommendations that we want to use to move our overall initiative forward. So this is when you can communicate what your ideas are. You've already worked it out with the team and saying, yes, this is what we recommend, and going forward with it. And the last one is to provide insight into the anticipated future performance. So this is not pulling out your crystal ball. No one knows exactly what's going to happen. You know, some big news item might happen and all of a sudden your issue is really taking off, and, you know, we didn't necessarily be able to anticipate that. The key here is to let everybody know up the ladder and down in that, hey, we have a big release of funding opportunities going to be posted on our website. We anticipate doing a lot of activities around that and really driving a lot of traffic to the site. So anticipate a big bump. Or inversely is let people know, hey, next month is August. Traditionally in August, we don't do a lot because our key audiences are out on vacation during this time period. So anticipate, or our year-over-year performance, we know is going to go down compared to last reporting period. Because at the end of the day, we don't want a situation where our boss is like, well, why did this number go down? This is a failure on your part. Why didn't you do better? Because as we're talking about, like, it's all about what our team has control over. Our team can't control if everyone goes on vacation in August. You know, that's a done deal. DC, a lot of times on the East Coast and actually across everywhere, things go into a lull in August. So making sure that we're communicating and anticipating those future issues and those future dips can really help build trust and confidence in your overall reporting strategy over the long term. So reporting it up to the top level, this is where you want a one-pager. This is where you want to have one page, either quarterly or yearly, that really sums up the overall high-level progress towards your yearly goals. This is where you're able to reflect back on those targets that you set. You're able to showcase what you learned and the successes that you did over the year or that quarter or that reporting period. And you're able to provide that insight into anticipated future goals. This is also where you can start that conversation for the next reporting period of like, okay, we hit this benchmark, or perhaps we fell short on that benchmark. What are we going to do as an organization? Are we going to adjust our benchmarks for next year? Are we going to adjust our staffing? Are we going to put more energy and funding towards specific things in order to really knock this particular KPI out of the park for the following year? This is a really great structure to use as a marketing or communications leadership to talk to your broader organization to really make sure that we're in alignment in what we're thinking. It's easy sometimes for our leadership to get a sense of, oh, you just throw a tweet out there, like, why is this so hard? Or, you know, this is, you know, the level of effort here doesn't seem in alignment. This is your way of being able to help tell that story and give better insights into what you're doing and how you're doing it and what could make it better. So we did a lot of information within that piece. And one of the big things, I struggle with this, but there is a lot of different ways to actually go into what a KPI should be. So we talked about a lot of the structure of thinking of how to make sure that it's the right one for you, how to make sure that it's measurable and everything else, and then how to report them out. So the key here is to actually figure out what your KPIs are for you. The issue is that every organization is different. Every organization has unique pieces, and there's so many different ways of putting together the content in your key audiences that there isn't necessarily a way in our little session today to necessarily go through all the options. So we did put together a free KPI report in how to actually select what those are. It's a really nice tool that a nice document that kind of outlines, here's the lay of the land. Here's a lot of options to select from. So you can kind of throw them out on the table within your team, do those exercises where you map your mission together and figure out which ones of those KPIs are actually mapping to your tactics and your goals and your objectives. And then you can do your litmus test in order to make sure that they're the right ones for you, and then you can start working on your reporting for them. So I do want to recommend going and checking this out. So we covered a lot. We put this all together, but I'm ready for questions, whatever they might be, if anybody has them. Feel free to add them to the chat box within the piece. And I'm happy to answer questions about specific situations or different themes of the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Autumn. This is Christina jumping back on as well. So I'm going to take a look at the questions as they come in. There was a quick question about where the white paper can be found. If you go on forum1.com, there's a list on the homepage itself. There's a list of kind of updated blog posts and case studies. It's directly there on the homepage. You can also go into our ideas section, and there's a section specifically on white papers, and you'll find it there as well. But it is directly on the forum1.com homepage. So let's maybe start with the first question, and that would be, as much as you talked about how KPIs vary from organization to organization, what are some of the most typical KPIs that you see, Autumn, as ones that organizations, especially in the nonprofit sector, are using?
Yes. So there's high-level KPIs and more granular KPIs, but let's say, for instance, I kind of use this long form content issue as a particular one. So let's say you're a research organization. And one of the pieces is that you want to make sure that you're distributing key content. This could either be promoting it via email or from social media, or just making sure that your website is optimized for SEO so people can find it via search. A KPI that I find really helpful is having, not necessarily having things in downloads, and measuring downloads is helpful in having that. So that in itself can be a KPI. But for a lot of these things, we have like longer content published on the site. So I say a couple KPIs would be having users hit a certain type of content on your site. So if you know that you publish reports, it's getting users not just to your website, because having users on your website is nice, but having users to key content within your site is really helpful. So driving users to a certain section of your site. Then from there, also measuring your average time on page on those certain kinds of pages. So if you know that you're publishing your reports in this area, you want to see your average time on page for your report pages to be at a certain level. Like, hey, we want people to spend at least 2 minutes on here reading and digesting this. So you want to be able to set that as a KPI, is like, we hit this many users hitting our key content, and then from there, the X number of those users actually, we can guess, absorb the content because they stayed on the page for more than 2 minutes, or they downloaded a document that's included on that page. So having KPIs designated towards specific content areas on your site is really key. I try to recommend going against doing average time on site, because if someone comes to your homepage and sits there for 5 minutes, that doesn't mean that they learned much or they really engaged or did anything. The key is to getting them into the core content that you want them to do. So that would be an example.
Okay, great. Sorry, my mute button was not flicking off. Okay, great. So we've got a next question from, I'm going to give this to you too, Autumn. Our next question is from Beth, and she mentions that one thing that they struggle with a lot is linking KPIs across their content areas. So that includes things like media hits that wouldn't be captured through Google Analytics. So do you have some advice on how they might collect or curate data that comes from different sources and not just Google Analytics?
Yes. So when you say media hits, are you and I apologize, you'll have to chat it back in the box. Are you referring to getting phone calls from the media, as in these are things that aren't necessarily collected by Google? Or is this more of a thing like we're just not able to tell when somebody is a reporter versus an average Joe coming to your website? Why we get that response, I'll just go off of, because the second part of that question says data that does not come from the many sources in Google Analytics. So if you're getting data from other places, like email registrations that you might use MailChimp or ExactTarget for, or if you're using another tool, there are ways of importing that data into Google Analytics in order to track the different steps. They call it more cross-channel analytics. Press clippings. So yes, we wouldn't be able to necessarily pull that in through Google Analytics, but something that I love that's a newer tool that's put out by Google is called the Google Data Studio. Really recommend checking it out if you have an opportunity. It's a great tool because if you use another service to track your press clippings or your media mentions, that you can also just pull that data in. You can just kind of upload it as a spreadsheet, and you can have a single dashboard that people can, your stakeholders, whether they're the doers or whether they are the more directors, you can have them all display within a single dashboard, which is really handy to map them together. I'm just reading the response, the email. But yes, so the big other piece is talking about sending users to your website and being able to track the difference. So if you have a tactic and your tactic is to send out a big email blast to encourage people to donate. So now we're talking about 3 different platforms now. We're talking about an email, we're talking about your website, we're talking about your donation platform. So how are you going to be able to track those things all across the way? It is possible, I don't have necessarily resources on hand to show this, but it is possible to track users across all 3 of those platforms. And I have to say, like, that is an extremely powerful metric to be able to demonstrate success in your email. Because at the end of the day, if someone opens your email and clicks on it, but doesn't do anything, you know, it's a tree falling in the forest, doesn't matter. I didn't even hear it. So what you can do is I recommend checking out campaign URLs. So you can append these things called campaign tags to the end of your email links. A lot of tools on the market these days, if you just Google it, or look into the help of your tool, it'll teach you how to do it specifically for your tool. And when you have that set up, you can see specifically if you send an email out to reporters, like let's say you have a list of an email list to reporters to let them know about a new press announcement. You can track people who clicked on that specific link, and you know that those are reporters. So when you do your reporting back out later, you can easily say, the reporters that we contacted via this method, this many came to the website, this many people came to the core content we wanted them to do, and this many of them actually stayed on the page long enough to most likely read it. So that, in the end of the day, is a much more powerful metric, as in I had these people do this specific thing, than a general how many people came to the website. Hope that kind of helps. My apologies, I kind of got into the very technical sense there. But yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, Beth says that that's helpful. Okay, we'll move on to Ken has a question. Can you give an example of why KPIs may be significantly different between groups within an organization, and whether it's important that all groups understand, agree, or approve of each other's KPIs?
Yes. So just to kind of pop us back to this diagram. So when we're talking about groups differing, I'm going to go out on a limb and interpret that as in how your organization is put together. So maybe one division of your group is really focusing in on education. Maybe this other group is really key in on activism, like getting people to take organize. And perhaps this other piece is really big on fundraising towards everything. I'm just kind of throwing out ideas here. KPIs across your entire organization are not going to be identical, but they shouldn't fight against each other. They should all be moving that mission and clearly map to that mission forward. So I usually, when I'm doing this with clients, I make a matrix where I show like each major initiative or each major like category of work that the organization does. And we literally go through and we map it together of like, here is a KPI or here's a metric that works across all groups versus here's a KPI that works across 2 of the 3. And being upfront and clear about which groups are going to be mapping towards which KPIs and where they can be shared is really important, because you're right, not everyone's going to have the same ones because you're trying to achieve different things doing different tactics. But it's utterly important that if 2 groups are having a KPI that's similar, that we do keep those the same so we can share it across the way, keeping in mind that they might have different benchmarks that they're working towards or targets that they're working towards, because they might have different budgets. As in, Initiative A is really going to sink a lot of effort into their email strategy. So therefore, we want to have their overall target to be higher than another initiative that's putting more heavily into something else. So you can have different pieces at the end of the day, but it's really great to be able to share these and make sure we know where they overlap, so then we can learn from each other. So if everyone's doing email, we can all learn from someone else's email activity.
Okay, great. We have a next one from Joseph, and he's wondering, for KPIs, is it an oversimplification to use individual Google Analytics metrics compared to multiple metrics such as pages, pages per session among new versus returning users?
Yes, Joseph, excellent question. And this is the number one reason I have stopped using goals in Google Analytics. I hate them. I'll be blunt. Dude, Google, you've done so well in so many different ways, but I'm really disappointed in you right now. I feel like you can do better. So, Joseph, you're right in saying that a lot of the individual metrics that Google is showing you are not nuanced enough, and they're not necessarily detailed enough in order to really give us the insights that you want. So what I do a lot of times is you can actually set up a lot of different pieces within Google in order to get more nuanced data. One of them being custom dimensions that allows us to collect, I showed you earlier an example of here where we're collecting author. That's done via a custom dimension, so that way when a page is shown, I'm able to see it's related to Mike Shoag or Autumn Rose, and able to show that within Google itself, which is super powerful. Other things that we tend to do is that we'll put the publish date on something. So we can easily say, show me all the new posts that were posted in the last month, instead of just the things that have been popular for all times. So I use a lot of segmentation within my reporting in order to get more nuanced and better, stronger information. A thing also to kind of talk about is that there's a new feature within Google that came out in the last 2 months that I'm still kind of figuring out the best way of leveraging, is that there's these new things called calculated metrics, which are super powerful because you can share with Google additional data, like I was talking about through Data Studio, and you can have it do a math for you in order to tell you what's going on. So that way, let's pretend you have 30 reports and you're only seeing traffic for 10 of those reports. There's no way of you knowing exactly how many other things are happening on your site that didn't happen during that period. So you can expand the data set by displaying that information. Probably not doing a best job explaining this right now. It's kind of a complicated piece, but Google, go to Google, check out calculated metrics. There's a lot of great information out there about it.
Okay, great. And maybe just last question. Our organization is thinking about using AdWords to push traffic to our website, and we're just wondering what types of KPIs would be most useful in tracking the success or how we're using AdWords.
Yes, AdWords is a great tactic to be using when we're talking about how things are done. And having AdWords being tracked across all your initiatives is extremely powerful. So that's an instance that when it makes sense to use AdWords for the different pieces, if we're going to look at our little graph here, if we're going to use AdWords for a lot of different pieces, we want to see success across all of them in a similar way. For anyone that's not familiar, most nonprofits are eligible for what's called a Google grant. So you get a lump of dollars from Google in order to do AdWords campaigns, which are those ads that show up on the right-hand side and the top of all your search results in Google. One of the biggest things I find when we take on AdWords campaigns with clients is that they are sending a lot of traffic, but no one's looking at what the KPIs are for that traffic. And they might be unique for those ones because that's the user set you're going after. But so often, I would love for anyone that's on this call today, go check out your AdWords traffic and take a look at how long are people staying on your site? Are they going to pages that you care about? And how long are they spending on your site? A lot of times what you'll find is that people are bouncing at almost a 95, 100% rate. People are not spending very much time on your site, and it's really sending dud traffic. So what a wasted opportunity. The key is identifying the right kind of ad that really speaks to the audiences that you're looking for, that has the right, you want to make sure that it has the right content that are speaking to your audiences. It has the right keywords that are relevant to the audiences that you're trying to attract to your site. And you want to make sure that you're landing people on an intuitive page. That page needs to make sure that it introduces your organization, it covers the issue that you're targeting, and making sure that people are doing what you want them to do, not just sending traffic. So having a KPI for your tactic of AdWords can be really powerful in making sure that you're sending and really, getting the full benefit out of that Google AdWords grant that you can get.
Great. Okay, and I think that's it for questions. We did have one request from Megan. She was wondering if you could show, I think it's slide 34, it's the doer slide, if you could just quickly show that.
Yes.
And just to let everybody know, we will be sharing the recording from today's session afterwards. You'll be receiving that likely by Monday. So if you did miss some things or there's certain slides that you'd like to see again, we're happy to have those available to you, and you'll be able to access that through the recording. Okay, so there it is, Megan. You've got your, I guess, favorite slide. Great. All right. Well, I think that that covers it all. Autumn, thank you so much for leading today's session. We're really pleased to see so many of you attending. If you do have follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to us in various ways through social media, by email, info@form1.com. And you'll also be hearing from us in the next couple of days with the recording, and you're welcome to reach back out through that email as well. So enjoy all this new knowledge you have about KPIs, and we hope to see you again soon and to be in touch soon. So thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.